Welcome back. Now let's say that we have drones in our world, these BP bots, and we're flying our own BP bot pawn, and we're going to be doing battle with other bots. Now let's say that during this battle, lots of little blaster beams will be flying around in the world, and we don't want those blaster beams to register any collision interactions with each other. Now on top of that, there's another issue that we ran into earlier on in the course, and we can see that issue by going into SM Drone, our static mesh, and opening the static mesh editor, and reminding ourselves that we have two sockets. We have Rifle L and Rifle R. Now, we had to move these sockets out away from the rifle barrels, and that's because if we place them inside the rifle barrels, our blaster beams will register hit events with the drone mesh itself, and that's not what we want. Just to demonstrate, I'm going to change from perspective to left view, scroll in a bit, change from lit to wireframe, and move these sockets inside the barrels, just like this. Now, if I go back to lit and perspective, I can see that those sockets are inside the barrels. Now, the problem with that is when I press play and attempt to shoot, my blaster beams are not able to fly into the world. And that's because they're triggering their on-hit events. We can prove that by going to blaster beam, opening that blueprint up, and here's our on-component hit event. We have handle on hit, but in addition, we can print a string and print the name of the other actor. We'll go ahead and use get display name here. And by hooking up these wires, I can now try to fire my rifles. And you can see that the other actor being hit is the bot pawn itself. And that's not exactly what we want. Well, we don't want collision interactions with our blaster beam and our bot pawn mesh. We also don't want our blaster beam interacting with other blaster beams, and we can solve this problem by creating a couple of custom collision object types. For one, I don't want the blaster beams fired from enemies to hit other enemies. And let's say this were a multiplayer game, I would not want blaster beams from players hitting other players. So I can create two new custom collision object channels. One for the player and the other for enemies. To create a custom object channel, we go to Project Settings under Engine, Collision, we find Object Channels and click on New Object Channel, and we give it a name. I'm going to call this Player, and the default response that all collision presets will have to the player type will be block. I'm going to click Accept, and we now have a player collision channel. I'm also going to create a new object channel called Enemy and leave the default response at block as well and click Accept. Now my bot pawn can use the player channel and my BP bot, the enemy, can use the enemy channel. So I'm going to create a new custom preset for the mesh controlled by the player. So under Presets, I'm going to select New and call this preset Player Mesh. Its collision enabled will be collision enabled query and physics, just like the mesh that we're currently using. Its object type, however, is going to be the new custom player object type. And for the description, we're going to say, for the mesh controlled by the player. Now, what I like to do when making new collision profiles is set all responses to ignore, and then one by one enable responses that I want. I don't want the player-controlled mesh to pass through world dynamic objects. Now, the small sphere is a world dynamic, but its collision response is going to be overlap to the player. We're going to have to change that as we're no longer using pawn as our mesh object type. So we can use a block response to world dynamic, and then for other player-controlled meshes and enemy-controlled meshes, we'll have block responses, so we can't pass through those. So let's go ahead and accept the settings for player mesh. And we'll also create a new collision preset called Enemy Mesh. This one gets collision-enabled query and physics, but its object type will be enemy, and for the description, we'll say for the mesh controlled by enemies. We'll give it an ignore response to all channels, block for world static and world dynamic, and block for player and enemy, and we'll accept. And now we can go back to our bot pawn, select our bot mesh, and go down to collision and set collision presets to player mesh. We can save that, and we can go into our BP bot, find our bot mesh, and change its collision presets to enemy mesh. And we can save that. Now we do have to go back into BP small sphere and find the sphere volume. Notice that it's set to overlap the pawn, but we're not using the pawn anymore. Now it needs to overlap with the player object type. So we need to change the pickup preset. Let's go back to collision presets and project settings. And if you can't see the new channels here, just click elsewhere and come back to collision and open that drop down, and they should be there now. So I'm going to open pickup. I'm going to select it, click on edit, and we're going to ignore all types except for player. That's going to be overlap. We can accept that. And now things should still work with our small sphere. So we're done with small sphere. I'm done with sphere spawner for now. I'm done with SM drone. But now my blaster beam has to be configured so that blaster beams shot by players ignore the player type and only block the enemy object type. And we also want our blaster beams to block with world static objects like floors and walls and other world dynamic objects. So here's what we can do. If our blaster beams shot by players need to have a different collision profile than the blaster beams shot by enemies, we can create two child classes based on blaster beam, and each of those has its own collision presets. Let's see how to do that. I have my blaster beam here. I'm going to browse to it and right-click on BP blaster beam and create a child blueprint class from it. So by selecting Create Child Blueprint Class, I now have created a child class of blaster beam. I'm going to call this one Player Blaster Beam. And I'm going to open BP Player Blaster Beam. And I'd like my beam mesh to have its own collision preset. And it's going to ignore everything except for enemy. And of course, world static and world dynamic. And I can even give this player blaster beam the player object type. That way it can ignore other blaster beams with the same object type. So let's go back to project settings and make a new preset. And for this one, I'm going to call it player projectile. That way I can use this for any projectiles shot by the player controlled pawn. Now, these blaster beams really only need query only for collision enabled. Why? Because they're being moved by a projectile movement component. Those use sweeping, and they're not simulating physics. So query only is perfectly fine. Now for player projectile, it's going to have the player object type, and I'll give it a description. It'll say projectiles that ignore players. And we'll have an ignore response for all types except for world static and world dynamic. Those will be block. And for the player projectile, we're going to block the enemy object type. And we can accept. Now we'll create a new one for enemy projectiles. So this will be called enemy projectile. It also only needs query only, and its object type can be enemy. And for the description, we'll say for projectiles that ignore enemies. And we'll have ignore for all types, except for world static and world dynamic. Those will be block. And for the enemy, we will block the player object type and accept. Now we have a new preset we can use for the player blaster beam. I'm going to go back to it, set its collision presets to player projectile, which I don't see, so I have to compile first. And there it is, player projectile, and we're done. and I can create a new child of BP Blaster Beam. So right-clicking on BP Blaster Beam, create child blueprint class. This will be BP Enemy Projectile. We're going to open that up, select its beam mesh, and change the collision presets to Enemy Projectile. And there we go. Now we just have to make sure that our bot pawn only spawns player blaster beams and our BP bot spawns enemy blaster beams. Looks like I called it enemy projectile. This should actually be consistent. I'm going to call it enemy blaster beam. And there we go. I'm going to save all. And we can go to our BP bot pawn and find the function where we're firing the rifle. It's called fire rifle. And here we have spawn actor BP blaster beam. We can actually change that class to BP player blaster beam. And now the player controlled pawn will spawn player blaster beams. And we can go to BP bots and find where we're spawning the blaster beam. It's in a function called spawn blaster beam. We can double click that, find our spawn actor node and change it so that it spawns a BP enemy blaster beam. There we go. So now we can play test by bringing in a BP bot. We can go ahead and press play, and we can play test. And our blaster beams are still working. But the good thing is, our player blaster beams, shot by the bot pawn, ignore all types except for enemy. Now, one last thing, if we don't want our blaster beams to trigger hit events when hitting each other, meaning when a player blaster beam hits an enemy blaster beam, well, we could make them ignore each other's object types by simply making them each an object type that is ignored by both blaster beams. Now, we could use a new object channel for this, or we could just set them both to world dynamic and have them both ignore world dynamic. It really depends on the needs of the game. Now let's just say we set them both to world dynamic. To do that, we go back to project settings, we find player projectile, we edit it, and set its object type to world dynamic and set its response to world dynamic to ignore, click on accept, and then we find enemy projectile, click edit, set its object type to world dynamic and its response to world dynamic to ignore and accept. Now we just have to test and make sure that the bot is going to damage the player controlled mesh, and it does. And we know that the player blaster beam and the enemy blaster beam are going to ignore each other's types. We have to compile in both their blueprints to see their collision presets get updated. But if we ever need our blaster beams to block a world dynamic type, then we might want to think about having a collision object channel for the projectile itself. All right, excellent job, and I'll see you in the next video.